Episode 9. The Siege of Vervunhive. After the victories at Monthax and Armisia, Warmaster Makarov drove his forces swiftly along the trailing edge of the Sabbat Worlds cluster and turned inwards to assault the notorious enemy fortress worlds in the Cabal system. Successful conquest of the Cabal system was a vital objective in the Imperial Crusade to liberate the entire Sabbat Worlds group. To achieve this massive undertaking, the Warmaster sent the line ships of the Segmentum Pacificus fleet forward in a pincer formation to begin the onslaught, while assembling and reforming his enormous Imperial Guard reserves ready for ground assault. It took close to 8 months for the troop components to convene at Solepsis, thousands of mass conveyance transports carrying many million Imperial Guardsmen. There were many delays and many minor skirmishes to settle en route. The Praegar regiments were held up for 6 weeks, engaging remnants of a Chaos Legion on Nonimax, and a warp storm forced the Sommerfrace and Sarpoi troopships to remain at Antioch 148 for 3 whole months. However, it is the events that took place on the industrial hive world of Varghast that are of particular interest to any student of Imperium military history. From a history of the later Imperial Crusades. Following the victories achieved during the previous phase of the Crusade, Makarov began to maneuver the Imperial front line for an advance on the Cabal systems and their fortress worlds. However, due to this huge logistical challenge, the Imperium lost time, allowing the archenemy to regroup further and challenge the Crusade's advance, with fresh legions of their vile followers being formed deeper within their territory and the distant sanguinary worlds. The conflicts within their own leadership following the Archon's death on Balhut were also nearing their end, and with a new Archon who could provide leadership and unite the various Magistars and Warlords of the archenemy hosts, the Crusade was set to face a more difficult challenge than they had since the victory at Balhut. It was during this period of reorganisation and preparation that one of the most well-known and heroic engagements of the Crusade occurred. The vile heretic, Heritor Asphodel, had been mentioned in this history before, and played a major role in the early stages of the Crusade's efforts as one of the most skilled and deadly archenemy commanders. Following the Imperial victory on Balhut, Asphodel, like many, fled the planet before the righteous fury of the God Emperor's servants could eliminate him, but not before his forces, including many of his signature woe machines, abominable and ingenious war machines, took a heavy toll not only of the soldiers of the Imperial Guard, but also the battle brothers of the Silver Guard Astartes chapter. Asphodel fled Balhut with the remnants of his own forces. The size of this force is unknown, but we can surmise that it included his personal warp-spawned bodyguard, perhaps some number of corrupted tech heretics and other degenerate hangers-on. The Heritor appears to have been gifted by his former Archon with 2 Dark Watch bodyguards, demonically spawned warrior creatures who could apparently phase in and out of the warp to appear behind a bow or avoid blows. In appearance, they were dark, tall but thin creatures possessed of great physical strength and speed, who uniformly wore glossy black body armour, chainmail cowls, and armed themselves with demonically cursed red power sabres. The Dark Watch are rare, but appear to be a dedicated cadre of fell warriors, gifted to the champions of chaos as guards and enforcers. The Emperor's Holy Ordos have restricted any further information on these creatures, so it is unclear what their origin is and whether they are a demonic entity, a Xenos breed, or some foul human mutation, altered and trained for their role. At some point in 766 and 767, the Heritor arrived at Varghast and began to spread his corruption to the world. Varghast. In order to understand the conflict, we will briefly cover the history of Varghast up to the Phaerozoica War, which we refer to, as it is commonly referred to now, much to the chagrin of the noble northern collective, as the Siege of Vervunhive. Varghast did not fall to the forces of chaos following the collapse of Imperial authority in the region. This was surprisingly common. The archenemy's hold on the region was dictated by their numbers, and so many worlds on the edges of the cluster, away from the main trade and transit routes, or of limited importance, or considered too costly an endeavour for the archenemy to attempt to take, were left in isolation. Varghast is a minor hive world in comparison to many within the Imperium. Prior to the siege, it consisted of 3 main hive cities, Vervunhive, Zoican and Vanik, as well as many small satellite mines and townships. It also had what will most likely one day develop into a hive city due to its survival unscathed from the war, the Northern Collectives, which did and still does control several lunar colonies. It is worth noting that the Northern Collective, or as they refer to themselves, the North Col, was the most experienced military force on the planet, if not the most numerous, due to their deployment several years before to their lunar colonies where they put down a secessionist rebellion. The hives of Varghast were relatively autonomous in their day-to-day operations and the affairs of their citizens. Following the trade war, which occurred in 679 or 90 years before the siege, Vervunhive's ruler was nominally in the position of planetary governor, at least officially, although the ruling family of each hive city dealt with their own affairs in terms of law and order, trade, production and security, with the scions of the various noble families and members of the merchant class vying for power within the various hives, and through the normal noble web of family ties and politicking between the hives across the planet. Each of the hives specialised in production of certain technologies, goods and resources. Most notably to this history, and without getting bogged down in the minutiae of administrative records, it will suffice to say that Vanik was the primary supplier of promethium, particularly to Vervunhive, and Vervunhive itself was heavily involved in mining and had a history in advanced virus and security software. The planet itself did not have a heavy mechanicus presence, perhaps due to its relative isolation within the Sabbat cluster, although the Administratum did have a presence on the world and several other Imperial institutions based there. The world possesses an advanced level of technology when compared to the rest of the cluster, and was fairly unique in that it was self-sustaining. Most hive worlds are not, and require continuous imports of foodstuffs and raw materials from worlds nearby to maintain their populations and economy. The population had not fallen into the depths of degeneracy which occurs on many worlds, with the citizenry living a prosperous life with only a light application of force by the authorities to maintain an orderly state. As mentioned though, Vervunhive held primacy and what could be considered a position of first amongst equals. Its rulers had none of the powers one would normally expect from a planetary governor. Each hive maintained its own military forces, and following the trade war, Vervunhive was granted the right to maintain a permanent garrison of 500,000 guardsmen, known as the Vervun Primary, as well as 70,000 auxiliaries, which would act as gun crews for the enormous number of artillery pieces built into the cyclopean adamantium sheathed walls which surround the city. This vast force was exempt from conscription into the Imperial Guard, with the idea being, perhaps, by whichever administrative clerk who made this agreement, that Vervunhive would be able to maintain its status with such a vast force of troops at its disposal, or at least the status quo between the hives, and stave off a costly and ultimately pointless for the Imperium planetary war. Order was maintained amongst this vast force of troops and the city's population by the Vervunhive Primary Commissariat, the VHPC, which acted like a miniature version of the Commissariat for the Guard, which was subordinate to this institution and had few powers over members of the actual Imperial Guard. Problems with jurisdictions and the use of judicial powers would emerge throughout the siege, and we will explore these as we progress. The VPHC was headed by a full off-world Imperial Commissar to ensure its loyalty, which at the time was one future people's hero, Commissar Pius Kell. The role of the VPHC seems to have morphed, or perhaps not, from its main vocation with the VPHC occasionally being used by the Vervunhive ruling class and merchant class as a kind of secret police force. The exact composition of the forces maintained by other hives prior to the grueling siege is not necessary for this history, and particularly in the case of Ferozoica, it is difficult to imagine the horrors which must have befallen this once loyal and productive hive. By unknown means, since its destruction records are now scant, the population was corrupted. We can hope, in a way, that there was opposition to the spread of the archenemy's power there, and that some resisted. But whether this occurred and what damage it could have done is a moot point, as the hive, its population, and its industrial capacity was taken by the great enemy, and, led by Heritor Asphodel, they were forged into a terrible weapon, which would cause horrific violence to those noble sons of the throne who oppose them. The distinction between trade and warfare is only seen by those who have no experience of either. Hieronymo Sondar, House Sondar, from his inaugural address. The Siege, Day 1. An hour before shift rotation, the klaxons across Vervunhive began to wail. They were joined by raid sirens, manufactory hooters, mill whistles, and even the ceremonial horns atop the ecclesiastical basilica. All raised up their alarm to the skies. Unease spread throughout the hive. Millions of workers looked at timepieces and up at the wailing klaxons in confusion. The main spine command station received dozens upon dozens of requests for clarification and confirmation from the Vervun primary forces stationed around the hive and manning its adamantium walls, as well as the military retainers and bodyguards of the noble houses. For months, Hive Ferozoica had isolated itself from its sister hives, and rumours had circulated of a military build-up. The people of Vervunhive believed that after 90 years, Ferozoica, or Zoica as it was known commonly, was about to launch a trade war. They would soon learn it was far worse. The population began to panic and head for their homes, or whatever safe place they had. The Vervun primary mobilised and began to man the walls in full battle readiness, raising the city's defensive guns. In the square of marshals, 300 Lehman Rust battle tanks of the 1st Primary Armoured Regiment, under the command of General Vigolian, the pride of the Vervunhive military, mustered and prepared to ride forth, out from the Sondar Gate and advance into the grasslands surrounding the hive. The events leading up to the Siege of Vervunhive would later be examined by the Crusade's intelligence departments, and many truths not healthy for public morale would be uncovered and disseminated on a need-to-know basis. It appears that, via some means, the now heretic leaders of Ferozoica corrupted the mind and soul of house leader Salvador Sondar, the Lord of Vervunhive, convincing the nutrient tank-bound ruler that Ferozoica was not going to war and that the two hives were peaceful trade partners, even as evidence of the massive build-up of military strength began to become apparent to Vervunhive's military forces, despite Salvador's attempts to hide intelligence, which he perhaps fully believed in his deluded mental state were false. The truth, however, could no longer be ignored, and having seen irrefutable orbital information showing the mass advance of the Ferozoican forces towards Vervunhive, Marshal Nid, the head of the Vervun primary and chief military officer of Vervunhive, decided to act, with Salvador Sondar refusing to respond for calls for the mobilization of the hive's military. Nid instituted laws laid down by Sondar's illustrious predecessor, Hieronymo Sondar, and had the noble house legislature vote to call up the military and prepare for war. Also, the vote called for Sondar to be dethroned and the legislature to take command of the hive-city. Salvador, enraged, slew Nid before he could enact the edict and sever his mind from the hive's civic and defensive systems. But Nid's action and temporary seizure of power allowed the hive to muster its defences, without which the Zoican hordes could have broken the walls of Vervunhive immediately. Additionally, requests for aid were sent out across the planet, and the local administrative contingent took it upon themselves as servants and representatives of the greater Imperium to send for aid via astropathic communication, to War Master Makaroth. This would be little consolation to the men of the 1st Primary Armoured, who, outnumbered and outgunned, ran headlong into the vanguard of the advancing Zoican war machine. The battle decimated the formation, and Commissar Cal took command, leading the remnants back to the city. As the battered armoured column sped back towards Sondar Gate, Zoican long-range artillery began to fire upon the hive, hitting the hab sectors outside the walls and hitting inside the hive. This caused panic amongst the population, and floods of citizens from the outhabs began to flee to the relative safety of the city, clogging its gates with traffic. Being a true and loyal servant of the throne, Commissar Cal ordered the armoured column to drive through the fleeing crowds, knowing that the hundreds of deaths this caused were worthwhile, as the need to preserve the Vervunhive's armoured forces was essential. Commissar Cal became known as the people's hero for salvaging these forces, despite the bloody events at the gates, and quickly rose to prominence as the city's wartime propaganda ramped up and is fondly remembered by much of the population. Again, despite some clearly erroneous rumours concerning his conduct in the war that still circulate amongst the surviving noble houses and some other arms of the government. Nid's attempted coup did have the benefit of awakening Salvador to the seriousness of the situation, which shows that his corruption was not complete, and he raised the city's void shields once the lead Zoican forces began bombarding the city from the grasslands beyond. Massive casualties ensued amongst the civilian population, with the ore works and manufactura hit, as well as the transportation depots around Vervia Gate, which suffered serious damage, wedging it open, and despite attempts to fortify this gateway, it would remain open and be one of the most bloody areas of the conflict, with the Zoican forces attempting to carry this initial lucky breach of the defences. With the void shields raised, the city's gates ordered closed, the advancing Zoican forces began to set up masses of artillery and began a continuous and immense bombardment on both the void shields and sweeping bombardments of the surrounding outer hive, which militarily covered their ground forces' advance towards the walls, but also resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of civilians and Vervun primary forces trapped outside, cut off from the city, either because of the closing of the defences, or the artillery bombardments, or the advance of the Zoican ground forces. Day 6. The gates to the east and west were left open until the 6th day, when the successors to Marshal Nid, Marshal Crow, ordered them shut, leaving 500,000 civilians still trapped outside the hive. The bombardment continued day and night, and the Zoican forces began to surround the hive, and fire began to come in from all sides, turning the outer hive into a fire-ravaged wasteland. The Ferrozoican batteries began to fire over the hive to hit the unprotected docks and habs on both sides of the River Hass. The noble houses argued about the harshness of this decision, leaving so many who had risked everything to travel the circumference of the hive to escape the enemy and would now still be left to die outside the walls. But the military situation demanded it, and despite votes against, notably from House Chase, the motion was carried by the legislature and Vervunhive's gates were closed. Day 8. It took 2 days for the full armament of Vervunhive to be raised and armed. Although weaponry on the battlements of the walls and gates had been raised at the start of the crisis, other older and more powerful weapons housed within the walls themselves were now manned and unleashed their wrath on the enemy gathering outside. These vast weapons had been dormant since the last trade war, but with their barrels raised, Vervunhive began to exact a toll from the surrounding enemy forces. Day 9. Food, water and energy rationing was instituted on the population, with Commissar Cal, the people's hero, leading by example, with a speech of his attached to the order stating that he would be not only observing the rationing, but rationing his own rations as well. Astute usage of the Commissar's notoriety had the desired effect on the morale of the population, who wished to be true to the people's hero and his selfless behaviour. Cal's observations and the last orbital data the Hive had before the siege began led House Command to estimate the Zoican forces numbered 5 million strong, with 80 to 90,000 fighting vehicles and thousands of gun batteries, a staggering force which would have required recruiting almost the entire Zoican population. Day 11. The North Carl collectives answered the call for aid from Vervunhive and dispatched the core of its forces, some 20,000 men and 5,000 fighting vehicles, to reinforce Vervunhive, lest Zoica conquer it, cross the river and attempt to conquer them next. As mentioned, the North Carl forces were some of the most experienced native soldiers on the planet. They began crossing the river using the ferries or by train and foot across the Haas Viaduct. Civilians were forcibly moved from their path, and it is recorded that 300 were executed by the VPHC to clear their route. The civilian refugees jeered the North Carl troops, who they saw as the reason for this latest horror, with General Zantz of the 2nd Enforcers stating, "This humiliating greeting did more to burn out North Carl morale than a month of bitter resistance on the wall." Day 14. Imperial forces arrived in orbit. Normally, assistance from the wider Imperium to a seemingly civil conflict would take the Imperium months, or perhaps years or decades to mobilise, but the pleas for assistance to War Master Makarov came in time for a troop convoy en route from Momfax to the front line to support the advance into the Cabal systems to be diverted to reinforce Vervunhive. The Imperial reinforcements consisted of the Royal Volpoon 1st, 2nd and 4th under General Notches Sturm, and the 5th and 7th Rowan Deepers under General Nash, 3 full regiments of Armenian armour under General Grismond, and the Tanith First and Only under Colonel-Commissar Gaunt. It took several days for these forces to be disembarked and moved via the same route as the North Carl forces across the Haas. Morale amongst the population was greatly boosted, and images of these arriving troops and their commanders meeting Vervunhive's leadership, and Commissar Cal in particular, were spread across the Hive. Day 16. As the last forces of the Imperial troops, the Tanith First, were being ferried across the Haas, the horizon lit up like a newborn sun. Vervunhive, to the northeast across the Haas, had been silent for days. It was Vervunhive's supplier of Promethean, and the two hives were linked by vast pipelines covered by the Ontaba Gate Fortress. It is unknown to this day what occurred here, but it is known that the hive was destroyed by atomic weapons, either purposely to avoid the hive's capture, or simply to remove them as a threat by the Zoican forces. This is the utmost heresy. Atomic weaponry is prescribed and banned by word of the Emperor of Mankind himself since the glory days of the Great Crusade. Marshal Crowe ordered the pipeline sealed, and the guilds did, all except one, Amchandus Warlan, who, seeing that Promethean was still flowing from those pipelines under his control, left them open and operational, and succeeded in making vast profits for his guild throughout the siege due to the shortage. This traitor's crimes will be discussed later. Political infighting now appears to have taken place, with tension between the native forces and the off-world commanders on what strategy to take. Commissar Cowell placed himself in between these two factions, taking advantage of his popularity and the resentment of the Vervunhive command to secure his own position in the evolving pecking order of command. This will be a feature of the war and will be explored in this history as we progress, but it underscores the problem of Imperial forces on paper outranking PDF and native forces, despite the practicalities of attempting to impose that kind of authority in reality. Not just Sturm had seniority amongst the Imperial commanders and vetoed the suggestions of General Grismond and Colonel-Commissar Gaunt, who advocated for an armoured sally forth to delay and damage the Zoican forces before they could fully encircle and launch a general assault on the city. Day 24. Then the bombardment stopped for 5 days. The tension from the waiting caused psychological and disciplinary problems amongst the Vervun primary and the civilian population, with the VHPC conducting executions on several occasions. Imperial forces deployed to the walls and were spread amongst the Vervun primary to bolster their morale and fighting power. The Tanith forces were deployed to the Spoil, the only breach in the Ceramite walls of Vervunhive, but considered nearly impassable due to it being made up of vast piles of industrial and manufacturing waste, and normally defended by a specialist force of the Vervun Primary known as the Spoilers. The fighting here would be intense and brought the first evidence of the chaotic corruption which had taken over Ferozoica when a Tanith sniper, Helene Larkin, unmasked a Zoican trooper, revealing the true horror of the foe. Day 29. The first Zoican assault began, with thousands of enemy troops marching on the gates across the entirety of the walls, with armoured support as well as dozens of vast siege machines, resembling siege towers, which swung upwards to the battlements to disgorge troops directly onto the walls. The horror of the enemy assault nearly broke the green Vervun Primary troops, but the presence of veteran Imperial Guard regiments helped steady the line and force the enemy back. Viva Gate was the site of some of the heaviest fighting, with the Imperial forces being hard-pressed to hold back the enemy. It was held by a large contingent of the Tanith First under Colonel Korbek, as well as the Vervun Primary under Colonel Modil, the commanding officer for the gate, with Major Racine as his second. Colonel Bulwer of the North Col was also deployed with his men, veterans of the Rebellion Wars in the North Col's lunar colonies. Colonel Modil, being inexperienced, deferred to Colonel Bulwer, who effectively took local command. Colonel Zantz of the North Col would later write, "You could fire a lasgun on full auto from the wall top and kill dozens, only to see the hole you'd made in their ranks close in the time it took to change power cells. If war is measured by the number of casualties inflicted, then even in that first night, we had won." Sadly, that is not the case. Sondergate nearly fell when one of the siege towers reached the top and deployed flamers, annihilating the Vervun Primary, but for the determination of the Royal Volpoon, and particularly the famed stormtroop of 10th Brigade, who scissored in from neighbouring areas of the wall they were stationed on and cut the Zoican shock troops to pieces. Major Colchis of the 10th and his second Sergeant Mantis attacked the enemy siege tower with anti-tank mines. Mantis died, but his mines succeeded in destroying the grappling claws, dislodging the foul machine. Colchis lost a hand in the fighting, and the Volpoon would hold back 3 more assaults and secure Sonder Gate. Haas West Fort was assaulted by several beetle-like siege machines, which scaled the walls and then disgorged troops onto the ramparts. They were estimated to be 3 times the size of a Lehman Russ battle tank and covered in the vile sigils of chaos. Colonel-Commissar Gaunt took command of the fort when its commander, Colonel Frader, was beheaded by a mortar round and rallied the defenders, who succeeded in holding them back. In one instance, a trooper, Bragg, fired missiles point blank into the troop deployment opening, causing an internal detonation. The most fearsome war machines deployed in this first assault were referred to as the Flat Crabs and Spiders. The Flat Crabs were the size of 5 Lehman Russ, bolted together, encased in segmented armour and wielding a super heavy Titan grade weapon designed to shatter defensive positions. 2, equipped with siege rams instead of guns, advanced on the gates at Haas West and Sonder, leading a veritable ochre-clad horde of Zoican troops and regular tanks. Second, and more terrifying to the defenders, were the Spiders, the largest war machines in the Zoican force, excluding the command pyramid deployed later in the war. 5 of these 100-metre long 8-wheeler behemoths with cantilever arms, allowing them to ascend the walls, advanced. As they rumbled forward, rocket and gun batteries across the vehicles fired up at the defenders. Their clawed wheels dug into and dragged them up the walls. The defenders destroyed 2 before they reached the walls, but the others scaled them. VPHC Commissar Vaucain destroyed 1 by having his troops roll shells over the lip of the wall onto the ascending war machines, which detonated, unfortunately killing the quick-thinking Commissar and 57 of his men in the explosive backwash. Another, which was the war machine which would block Viva Gate when it was destroyed by the North Col and desperate fire from the heavy artillery batteries blowing its head off. The final Spider reached the top of the walls at Haas West Fort and reaped a bloody harvest amongst the defenders until General Grismond had his waiting Arminian tanks, arrayed in the House Anco Chem Works, elevate their guns and fired as one, smashing the beast backwards off the wall to land on the other side, crushing hundreds of Zoicans assaulting the walls. The Zoican assault ended at 2 AM local time into day 30. The remaining flat crabs waddled backwards from the walls into the smoke-wreathed and fire-blasted urban landscape surrounding the hive. Every broadcast speaker in the hive played a victory hymn at full volume. Vervunhive had lost 34,000 troops, 20 missile emplacements, 50 gun posts and 10 heavy artillery silos. The walls were scarred and weak points had emerged, but the enemy's first assault had been held.
Episode 9, Part 2, The Siege of Vervunhive. The first trick a political officer of the Commissariat learns is learn to lie. The second is trust no one. The third, never get involved in local politics. Commissar General Delane Oktar. Over the next 5 days, the Vervunhive defenders licked their wounds and reorganised, preparing for the next big push. Artillery fire was continuous, but with the void shields activated, the bulk of the hive was free from damage. Verveya Gate was wedged open by the colossal wreck of the spider tank, which had been brought down by pinpoint artillery fire as it pushed the gates open. Unable to close the gates, the Imperial forces fortified and entrenched around the gate opening, digging trenches, allowing them to create a kill zone around the area. This was a reasonably open stretch of land, as it was formerly the transportation hub, where rail trains from the other hives would come and go with trade resources. Colonel Corbeck and a contingent of ghosts was still stationed here to stiffen the Vervun primary units, and the Northcol forces, which had deployed in full strength along with their artillery. Day 33, the second storm. The Zoicans now concentrated their attack on 3 vulnerable points, rather than generally across the whole hive. They launched mass artillery bombardments and pushed at these 3 weakened points in their defences. The defences of Verveya were almost overrun at the start of this attack, and it appears that Colonel Modine, the Vervun primary commander for the area, suffered from a break in morale, unable to cope with the situation, and Colonel Corbeck of the Tanith First and Colonel Bulwar of Northcol enacted a secret arrangement known as Anvil to take command of the sector in the event the Vervunhive commander failed to do his duty. The assault on Sondare Gate ended with a relatively swift victory for the Imperial defenders, which, after 2 hours of hard fighting, forced the Zoicans to withdraw. Colonel Grismond, commanding his Narminian armoured forces, lined up in the square of marshals, in a mirror of the Vervunhive tanks which had done the same before their sally forth and swift annihilation over a month before. Colonel Grismond, who would later achieve the rank of General, redeployed to Verveya before it fell, along with 2 Vervun primary mechanised regiments and a Volpun battle group. Unfortunately, the orders from Hive Command were imprecise, and the massed mechanised forces became bogged down in traffic along the roadways of the sector, throttling their movement so that only a trickle of the tanks managed to push in to support the Northcol, Tanith and Vervun primary troops which were being punished by the Zoicans. Grismond, growing furious, ordered his tanks off the main routes and gunned them through the industrial buildings, smashing through factory complexes, chain link fences and following any route which would allow them to escape the logjam and reach the front. Eventually, VPHC forces interposed themselves between the racing tanks, halting them and demanding they return to the highway. Grismond dismounted his tank, arguing with the VPHC that the route was necessary, whatever damage it may do to the facilities. In the argument that followed, one of the VPHC commissars drew a pistol and was punched by Grismond for the insult. He was arrested along with 4 of his officers, leaving the battle-hungry Narminians strung out and leaderless, watched by the growing number of VPHC forces surrounding them. This was just one of the terrible events to occur this day due to a lack of discipline and coordination between the Off-World Guard and the local PDF, and generally pointed to a lack of proper command and control from Hive Command, which showed its faults clearly in the midst of this battle. A friendly fire incident occurred when a Vervunhive mechanised force with Hydra flat cannons opened fire upon the Volpoon, rushing to Verveia. Believing that the Zoicans had broken through the gate and had surrounded them, 13 men died needlessly. The command structure broke down as the inexperienced Vervunhivers, whose only experience of war was drills and practice exercises, could not cope with the changing situation. Worse, the Hive's military communication network was modelled on those of the Imperial Guard, and, unfortunately, used the same channels as the Guard, meaning that Vox between the different areas was confused, as Imperial Guard and Vervunhive forces spoke over one another, meaning that no one could communicate effectively without interference, except for close-range Vox between individual squads nearby. General Nash and his Rowan Deepers stationed at Crowgate was able to re-establish full command of his forces using a wideband transmission his forces had been forced to rely upon during a previous campaign, and was a trick his officers were well aware of. The Volpoon had comparable success, but their choice was a band hampered by intense static caused by the Void Shield. At Crowgate, the enemy bombardment of the adamantine walls was growing so intense that the walls, somehow, were beginning to dent and glow with the hits from the continuous bombardment of solid shot, rocket and explosive shells. General Nash organised his meagre armoured forces directly inside the gate to counter the 500-strong Zoican armoured force visible beside the tracks leading to the gate, as well as the mass infantry force which was visible on the outskirts of the ruined house. Nash understood that the gate could not fall with Verveia in such a terrible situation, as 2 breaks in the wall would strangle the disorganised defenders, allowing the enemy to stream into the hive before troops could be organised and pushed to counter. The fighting at the half-open Verveia gate was intense. Zoican forces pushed forward, taking horrendous casualties in the process, but attempting to forge a beachhead and secure this point of entry. Wave after wave of Zoican infantry advanced into the breach, with the defenders on the walls and the defenders inside the breach mowing them down, but it was gradually taking its toll. With reinforcements filtering through slowly, the possibility of a Zoican victory was still in the balance. As the Zoicans advanced, the Imperial forces were gradually forced back by the mass volleys of firepower from the advancing Zoican cohorts. However, visibility became limited and street fighting began building to building, enabling the Tanith contingent to utilise squad tactics and the terrain and buildings to best effect. This allowed them to surround advancing units, catching them in crossfires as they advanced further into the hive. The Imperial forces halted the advance and managed to catch the Zoicans in the large open spaces surrounding the Verveia gate, in the area of the railhead, which was formerly used for trade and rolling stock. The gate itself was still contested by Imperial forces led by Colonel Corbeck, but Zoican forces continued to push around their defensive positions and advanced as cited earlier. But with the gate contested still, the Imperium gradually began to check, annihilate and secure a united front line around the gate. The Zoican forces pushed on relentlessly, hoping that by sheer weight of numbers they could secure the victory. They began to chant, marching in column behind the banners bearing the heraldry of Ferozoica and other dark runes and glyphs devoted to the dark gods. Colm Colvick prepared to be overwhelmed when mass lasfire began to cut the Zoicans apart. 9 platoons of Vervun Primary marched upon the gate and turned the tide. Led by the hero of Vervunhive, Commissar Kell, their timely arrival saved the defenders from annihilation and turned the enemy forces, with the few remaining Zoicans forced to flee back through the gate. Kell had left high command at dawn when the attack began, and unable to contact any command channels, he gathered forces as he advanced to Verveia, taking 6 hours on foot, bypassing the blocked highways and thoroughfares to reach the front. North Carl armour and men supported the flanks of this rough and ready force, slaughtering the fleeing Zoicans. The Tanith had held the gate alone for an hour, taking terrible casualties due to the mismanagement of the Vervunhive command, but it was Commissar Kell who would be known as the hero, quite rightly, for his personal bravery and decisive action, as well as the images of him firing at the enemy and holding the breach with the banner of Vervunhive in his hand, which would be distributed throughout the hive, showing the people's hero had once again achieved victory. The gate was soon secured, with additional reinforcements filtering in, along with 50 Northcol tanks, their guns facing the breach. The Zoicans withdrew across the hive with this reversal, and the loss of uncountable dead. The Imperial forces' death toll was great. At Verveia Gate alone, an adjacent spoil sector, which the Zoicans had also struck in force, 500 Vervunhive elite spoilers, 3,500 Vervunhive primary, 900 Northcol, and near 100 Tanith had fallen, with many more wounded. Shortly after this victory, Colonel-Commissar Gaunt arrived and immediately made for the Vervunhive command position. There he ordered the arrest of the officers present and summarily executed Colonel Modil for cowardice. In the aftermath of this victory, many in the hive began to believe that this was the turning point, and as the public vox system gave the news of the battle, a desperate public began to think the storm had passed, and parties and feasts began in the upper and lower hives. The worst of these celebrations was broken up by the VPHC. If they thought the Zoicans were defeated, they would be soon rudely awakened from this delusion. Day 35. The Imperial forces licked their wounds and fortified the inner gate of Verveia, and within 12 hours they had raised concrete concentric defensive walls and dug extensive trenches using the many work gangs as labour. Verveia was no longer a weak point, but had become a death trap, with the entrance into the hive a kill zone for any Zoican forces trying to force it. The Tanith manned the position as well as the elite Blue Blood 10th Brigade of Volpoon stormtroopers, which attempted to work better together despite previous grievances between the two formations. Political manoeuvring and strife continued amongst the High Command and the Vervunhive nobility. Commissar Cal, figuring that his great service to the throne in this conflict would lend weight to his requests for a return to active frontline service in the Crusade, manoeuvred to achieve this, using his notoriety as the people's hero for his own purposes. None can doubt his personal bravery or prowess at war, but looking back upon these events, it is clear that even if only subconsciously, Cal saw this war as an opportunity to restart his career. To that end, he sided with the Vervunhive command in its incarceration of General Grismond for disobeying orders when he diverted his armoured column through the property of nobles when rushing to reinforce the breach at Verveia. Also, he supported General Sturm and Marshal Crowe, who argued against a sally forth by Imperial forces and a continuation of a defensive war, rather than risk their armour outside the hive's defences. Gaunt was not best pleased by this turn of events, and sought to see the release of Grismond, knowing he was a superlative armoured commander and would be needed to lead his Narminians, one of the elite armoured formations in the entire Crusade roster. But having recently executed a high-ranking Vervun primary officer, and being one of the Imperial Guard forces to criticise the shortcomings of the High Command, he had no sway as yet. So for the moment, this clique remained in control of the Imperial forces, and Grismond was held under arrest facing trial. Ever is the way that personal ambition and hubris harm the affairs of man, even when their doom stands before them. At nightfall, the Zoicans resumed their bombardment of the city, and the noise of shells striking the walls and the constant discharge of the voids reverberated throughout the city. The Tanith attached to the Vervunhive forces defending the spoil deployed scouts and sniper teams into this rough terrain, advancing 2 kilometers into the spoil, fighting skirmishes with Zoican infiltrators and snipers along the way. This shadow war would continue throughout the conflict, with snipers on both sides hunting each other. Scout Sergeant McCall would be the first to report the new chant rising from the Zoican lines. Heritor Asphodel, Heritor Asphodel. The next Zoican thrust did not come from where it was expected, but from the northeast. The Promethean pipelines from the recently glassed Vanik Hive had been ordered closed and sealed to halt such a situation, but one Gilder, filled with greed and seeing that the Promethean continued to flow, disobeyed this command, gaining massive profit for his house in the cut-off hive. One can blame the hive's authorities for not noticing this situation, or at least not checking that the orders of High Command had been followed, but the blame lies with Gilder Amkundurst Warlen. May his name be remembered in infamy. Before Warlen could be brought to justice by Makarov's staff shortly after the siege, he was killed when his other crimes of murder were discovered by a recovering Gaunt, after he had attempted to murder and thus silence Medical Officer Dorden and Surgeon Anna Kurth. Using these pipelines, Zoican sappers infiltrated Ontabi Gate Fortress, or as it was also known, Haz East. Placing mines in the foundations and around this bastion, they detonated a surprise attack, demolishing a large chunk of the fortress and cracking the defences of Vervunhive. With the foundations of the wall shattered, arch-enemy artillery began to pound the remains. The Imperial defenders scattered in confusion as the bombardment and the raging fires swept across the walls and the fortress. Haz East had fallen. The guard forces on the scene, including elements of the Tanith First and Rowan Deepers, deployed to bolster the Vervun primary regiments and reacted commendably quickly, beginning a strong defence of the breach. But against the firepower now firing from directly below the void shields and directed into the hive through the broken defences, there was little they could do but withdraw or die. A fighting retreat began into the urban areas of the hive against the advancing arch-enemy infantry, and then mass armoured forces moving into the hive through the breach they had carved through with a combination of mines, artillery and heavy energy cutting beams. 10 kilometres south from Haz East, at Crowgate, General Nash spotted an enemy armoured formation of 1,000 vehicles advancing around the hive to the breach at Ontabi Gate. Across the hive's defences, Zoican forces began to attack. Crowgate was now receiving massive bombardments. Infantry forces were assaulting the Spoil and Verveya Gate. Mass heavy armour and infantry formations were assaulting everything from Sondair Gate to Haz West Fort, and everywhere the vox and throats of the Ferozoican heretics exclaimed Heritor Asphodel, Heritor Asphodel. At Hive Command, Marshal Crow furiously refused the suggestion of General Sturm to evacuate the city and flee across the river, telling him, "You were sent here to defend Vervunhive, and that's what you'll do." He ordered the release of General Grismond and the execution of any VPHC official that stood in the way. Sturm, with Grismond, was ordered to Verveya Gate, and Sturm was to take command of that defence. Marshal Crow donned his personal war gear, and with his staff, left to command the defence of Sondair Gate in person, stating, "Vervunhive lives or dies tonight." It was at this moment that Salvador Sondair's mind finally broke from the whispers of the traitors of Ferozoica, playing upon his paranoia and ambition, convincing him to deactivate the shield. The effect was immediate. A subsonic boom washed across the city, blowing windows out across the hive. The temperature dropped by 6 full degrees instantly as the intense energies of the shield disappeared, and the smoke from the fires raging across the defences was sucked into the hive, covering it in a dense acrid fog, lit by the great pylon burning itself out with the suddenly disconnected energies, like a vast, furious candle in the centre of the city. Not only this, but there arose a great rumble of noise from the throats of every Ferozoican throat, a terrifying cry of triumph as they saw victory was at hand and pushed on with ever more fury. Behind the main enemy lines, artillery adjusted their aim. Marshal Crow arrived at Crowgate, armed and armoured in the finest equipment available, just as the shield collapsed, and watched with horror as the true power of the enemy's massed artillery unleashed itself on the city. The walls shuddered. Troops, civilians, defences, ramparts, all blown apart by firepower held at bay by the shield for so long. Crow could not leave, knowing that the defenders would lose heart if they saw their commander withdraw at this critical moment. So, raising the sacred blade of Hieronymo Sondair high, he ran to the wall to lead the defence. Suspecting, however, this was no technical fault, he ordered his lead bodyguard to return to the hive on his authority, to deal with the situation. Across the hive, death came. Wave after wave of enemy shells smashed into the central hive, slaughtering untold thousands in those first moments. It is estimated that 2.5 million civilians and refugees began to flee north towards the river, hoping to escape the hive and the coming horror. The hive became an inferno as fires raged across it, with the continued boom of shell detonations adding to the chaos. Along the railways leading to the hive, the Ferozoicans brought up vast rail-bound artillery pieces which launched huge shells into the hive, as well as rockets and fire from uncounted Earthshaker barrels. Sergeant Vol, leading a mixed force of guardsmen from Haz East into the Hive's Hab zones, entered into running battles with Zoican insurgents who had pushed further into the city via the Promethean pipelines at the same time as the sappers were causing chaos behind the hastily prepared Imperial defences. General Zantz attempted to move up and reinforce the eastern situation when he and his force of 700 Northcol troops in Chimera APCs were hit with pinpoint artillery, presumably called in by Zoican infiltrators acting as spotters, annihilating the force in a period of minutes, before they could reach the front and help to stem the tide. As the shields collapsed, House Command fell to chaos, and the commanding officer there, and second in command of Vervunhive's military, Vice Marshal Anko, broke. His mind was unable to comprehend the information flooding the tactical maps and arrays and the calls for orders and assistance from across the Hive at this critical moment. Stepping away from the tactical display, he smoothed the front of his white dress uniform, adjusted his belt, and drew his Orzo pistol. He shot the table 8 times, and it is reported that he then shot 2 of the aides nearby, before proceeding to the end of the balcony the command station sat on, overlooking the pack command centre, and began to fire into his own men. It is here that we see the difference between planetary organisations and Imperial ones, for instead of executing this mind-broken commander as any righteous true commissar of the Progenium would have, a VPHC officer and 2 servitors tried to wrestle him instead, perhaps out of fear of slaying this high-ranking native. Whatever their reason, Anko blew the VPHC officer's head off, and reloading his pistol, continued to fire into his own men. This would be a bad enough situation for House Command, leaving the embattled Imperial forces starved of information and leadership. But then, a vast missile, fired directly at Hive Command, smashed through the observation window in a whirlwind of glass, which alone shredded Anko and the majority of the command staff, before detonating, turning Vervunhive's House Command into a burned-out crater in the Hive surface. Across the Hive, the overwhelming power of the Zoican artillery was decimating it. The Basilica of the Ecclesiarchy east of the Commercia, which had stood for 2,000 years, through the settlement wars, the colonial uprising, and the Podesto Gurvandi power struggle, and all the other wars and uprisings of Vervunhive's history, was demolished by sustained bombardment from a battery of Earthshakers, which caused rivers of lead to form from the molten remnants of the mighty church's roof. At Crowgate, General Nash proved his worth when he managed to not only hold off the attacks from outside the gate, but also gathered a force of Rowan Deepers and Vervun Primary to push north to help to stem the tide of heretic forces. As one of the heroes of this terrible moment, he managed to secure the gate and knock out the enemy's thrusts, while moving a third of his force, some 1,500 Deepers and 3,500 Primary, northwards to push back against the breach at Untabi Gate. The Deepers, normally considered lazy and too easygoing by Crusade Command, showed their prowess in this push, slaying 4,500 Zoican troops and destroying around 100 armoured units, holding their advance south from the breach dead in its tracks for 2.5 hours, before they too were overrun by sheer numbers. The fighting became so intense and brutal in the Habs and streets that General Nash would fall in a ruined worker hab before dawn, after being shot 19 times before his last position was overrun and the Zoicans finally moved deeper into the Hive. At Sondar Gate, the situation was a madman's vision of war, as artillery shells flew back and forth, and the night was lit by fire, explosions, and the constant zap of thousands of las rifles firing continuously. Zoican stormtroopers raised ladders and brought forward siege towers in anachronistic defiance of the advanced weaponry being unleashed all around them. These siege towers, resembling vast mechanical praying manti, used enormous mechanical claws to rip the front of the parapets away and pull down the walls' towers, before, locking their limbs together, formed plates or ramps which saw a flood of Zoicans charge directly onto the walls, finally taking them. Marshal Crow died fighting, and would later be found bayoneted through the heart. Sondar Gate had fallen. The defence of Verveya Gate and the spoil was under Colonel Cordray and Major Rawn, and they fought it fiercely for 6 hours, holding back the Zoican attack, which came relentlessly, no matter how many they slew. Ammunition was beginning to run down, and they could not contact House Command nor any other unit, so simply continued to hold their position against the Zoican onslaught. The Tanith snipers and scouts stationed at the spoil wreaked a massive toll on the Zoican infiltrators and stormtroopers attempting to break through, but were held in check. And though they kept coming, the outside and gateway of Verveya was a charnel house of dead Zoicans and broken armoured vehicles. Colonel Corbeck's troops and the North Col, under Colonel Bulwer, had been pulled back from the wall for 2 nights for rest and recuperation, and now advanced back towards the gate. The Ghosts heading west and the North Col east, where they could deploy to Crow or Verveya depending upon the situation. Corbeck eventually made contact with Cordray, informing him that Sondar must have fallen and to prepare for attacks to the rear, as his force of some 300 Tanith were now locked in street fighting with Zoicans, attempting to strike at the gate, exclaiming, "This is the one, boys! Do it right or die here!" The Tanith forces at their billets were ordered to evacuate to the chem waste ground surrounding their position when the shield fell. Sergeant Bray, in command there, reasoned that the rough terrain would be a better position for the Tanith to dig in and use their skills to the best, rather than remain in a fixed position in a warehouse area which could not be easily defended. This was a canny move by the sergeant, considering he had no orders nor contact with any higher ranking authority, as just as the Ghosts began to dig in and entrench themselves, the billets and the entire area they had been stationed in was targeted with heavy bombardment, which would have seen the whole force of some 500 Tanith annihilated in one fell swoop. As they could not yet determine what the wider situation was, only that the shield was down and a general attack was taking place, with the fog of war descending upon them, it was the initiative of these veteran officers which enabled the Imperial forces to compose a rough sort of defence in these crucial hours of chaos. Within the VPHC facility, a gunfight had erupted during the attempted execution of General Grismond, with the Volpoon under General Sturm coming to rescue and liberate the Narminians. Commissar Kell was stripped of his rank and placed under arrest by Gaunt for attempted subversion of Imperial law. Grismond would return to his regiment while Gaunt and the Volpoon would ascend to the heights of the Hive to reactivate the shield and remove Salvador Sondar from his position. At the same time, the Lord Chase and Marshal Crow's bodyguard were doing the same thing, and the three forces joined together, fighting through the now clearly corrupted ruler of Vervunhive's servitor bodyguards. Salvador Sondar had been broken in body and mind, and fallen utterly to chaos, in his insanity, festering in his insanity within his amniotic tank. He had pledged himself to Heritor Asphodel, and as a reward he had been gifted with a chaotically corrupted servitor, a mechanical horror of enormous proportions. Sondar's fascination with his meat toys was infamous in the noble houses, and many efforts had been made to curtail his surgical whims and clone farming over the years. From a history of Verdast, this thing was truly terrible, more even than the deluded creation of a mad flesh engineer. The insanity of the warp was in it. 1,800 kilos of scarred meat and gristle, bigger than a hurricane antledon, a jigsaw of human parts fused into the carcass of a wild uruk from the grasslands. Limbs twisted and writhed around it, some with grasping hands, some animal, some wet, glistening pseudopods like muscular feet of giant mollusks. The massive head was an eyeless mouth of needle teeth that smacked slackly and gurgled. The donor uruk's vast horns swept outwards from the low skull crest. A multitude of cables, feeder tubes and wires suspended it, but unlike the other meat puppets, this thing moved of its own volition, pawing and stamping the soft carpet, writhing and pulsing. The smell was overwhelming. From a history of the later Imperial Crusades. A terrifying combat ensued as the beast took the punishment of the surviving force. The Volpoon elite racked the beast with hellgun fire, and it took this punishment, along with fire from the rest of the force. It was in this moment that Commissar Kell sacrificed himself and regained his honour when he threw himself at the beast with a canvas web of grenades taken from one of the fallen. This is one of the reasons Commissar Kell has not been expunged from Imperial records, and in the popular consciousness of the citizens of Vervunhive, he is still remembered as the people's hero, for the muddy details of earlier events have not been divulged to the general populace. Gilbert, given permission by Gaunt as a kind of payment for the Volpoon saving the Commissar in this struggle, was allowed to end Salvador. He fired his Hellgun through the amniotic tank's viewing porthole, leaving the writhing and decrepit ruler in the now fluidless tank, before firing a grenade in to finish the job. The mortally wounded Lord Chase was the only one who could reactivate the shield, its systems being locked to any but those with the genetic code of one of the noble born, and he did manage this before he succumbed to his wounds, saying in his last moments, "Sic semper tyrannis." The last ditch. With the shield reactivated, the Zoicans were deprived of their advantage, and despite their vast numbers, the defenders now had a chance to counter. Cordray and Rawn extracted their forces and withdrew from Verveia Gate before they could be encircled, adding to the Imperial forces' formation of a strong line of defence within the inner hive, as the Imperial forces withdrew from the walls in a vast fighting withdrawal until they could find firm ground and set up a solid front. Colonel Corbeck's troops holding the warehouse of Guild Gathran Agriculture formed the centre of the line, with retreating units forming up alongside this ramshackle defence. In the northeast, Sergeant Val, with a mixed force of 170 men from Tanith, Primary and Deepers, was holding the northern shore and the now burning docks. Heretic armour had taken the bridge and were pushing forces directly into the hive, with the Promethean depots now ablaze and the few Imperial units in the area withdrawing before the enemy. The end seemed nigh, but relief was coming. Commissar Colonel Gaunt now took command. Major Ott, the senior surviving Vervun primary commander, presented Gaunt with the sword of Hieronymo Sonder and handed command of the hive to him. General Sturm had been found attempting to flee with the refugees across the river. He was stripped of command and placed under arrest after treacherously ordering the evacuation of the city and attempting to shoot Gaunt. Many grave events for the Imperium would stem from this moment, but we will cover them later. Although technically General Grismond had higher rank, armour are always subservient to infantry commands. Gaunt took command and began to reorganise and provide leadership to the shattered Imperial forces. This had an immediate effect. Word was also sent to Crusade Command, with Gaunt stating, "I will not ask Makarov for aid, but I want him to understand the situation here. If he deems it worthy of his notice, he will assist us." The newly released General Grismond rejoined his Narminiad Armoured and immediately drove this elite regiment towards Antabi and Crow Gates to counter the incoming Zoican armoured forces flowing into the city, stating, "Let's give 'em hell!" The Northcol armoured groups left without direction in the centre of the hive were ordered south to Sonder Gate and to reinforce the Tanith forces under Colonel Corbeck. Imperial units across the hive were contacted and received orders from Gaunt. Known as a strong infantry commander and frontline officer, Gaunt had never been given the opportunity of high command, and this is looked back upon as a defining moment in his career, where Crusade Command noted his skill and ability as he forged a concerted defence and counterattack against the Zoican horde. Many reflected that he reminded them of Slado in this moment, showing drive and purpose, being able to handle information and direct forces which would have been viewed as an impossible task by many commanders. This was noted amongst even the highest echelons of the Crusade. It was during this time that the scratch companies made themselves known. Civilians and workers, as well as Vervun primary troopers who had been separated from their units over the last several weeks, had formed into companies, armed with whatever weaponry they could find, battling it out in the vicious street fighting that erupted since the Zoicans pushed into the city, and before, with many being left stranded outside the walls in occupied territory. Many of these bands have been formed, but still to this day it is unknown how many. As Colonel Bulwer's Northcole divisions were being cut to pieces at crossroads FG/567 in the eastern Habs by heretic armour and near overrun, he laid about him with his power claw and fired point blank with his auto pistol, believing this was the end. When, all of a sudden, a large contingent of these civilian militia came to their aid, led by a spoil worker known as Argon Soric, a smeltery foreman before the war. Using industrial equipment, such as mining charges looted from the storehouses of their workplaces, they merged with the regular troops, stabilising the situation somewhat, and pushed back this latest wave of Zoican attackers until the Narminian armour arrived. General Grismond was fast becoming and would be a legend in the Sabbat Crusade, with his Narminian armoured forces being elite tank killers with an impressive kill count. Here he showed his skill as a master of armoured warfare during the engagements, which are still taught to trainee tank commanders to this day. The Narminian tankers were the elite, with only those capable of moving at pace and being able to fire accurately and repeatedly qualifying for entrance into the regiment. Having been ordered to advance to the east, Grismond marshalled his forces into a solid column, safe from the kind of punishment the Northcole armoured forces, with the shield now raised. He dispatched sentinel and foot-based spotters ahead, knowing that they could not give him the exact location of the enemy, but would be able to give estimates of their numbers and their direction of advance. He ordered his tank column south, then east, to catch the front of the enemy's armoured push in the flank. His plan was to launch a full tank strike, and enact a personal speciality of theirs, the scissors. Once they had found the front wedge of the Zoican armour, 40 Narminian heavy tanks gunned forward at full speed, firing into this surprise Zoican armoured column, smashing through them before turning around on the far side to run through the damaged and confused enemy force. They had already destroyed 72 enemy armoured vehicles, but as they turned, the rest of the Narminian armoured began their assault, so that both sides would attack both flanks as one, and showing the superiority of his tankers, they never suffered a single friendly fire casualty nor collision, as they had experience from conducting the scissors 9 times in previous campaigns. Using Vox beacons to help distinguish who was friend from foe, the Narminians annihilated the Zoicans' push in the jaws of the scissors. Over the course of the 35th day, the Narminians conducted 3 more scissor strikes, breaking the Zoicans and forcing them back and back, littering the inner hive with the shattered, burned out hulls of heretic armour. In a few hours, the Narminians had lost 2 tanks for 200 Zoicans, a fine tally which stabilised the front, but the heretics had an almost endless stream of armour to call upon. Come nightfall, all the units in the east were able to resupply and begin to push forward to support the Narminians' thrust. Towards Sonder and Verveer gates in the south, the situation was not as good. The Northcole armour had not the inspired leadership of Grismond, and Major Clodel, their commander, fell to straight-up duelling with the Zoicans in a crash of armour, which, although it held the line, saw no gains and a steady loss of Imperial tanks. With that, the 35th day ended. The city was shattered, the population were trapped, killed or fleeing across the river. The battlements had fallen, and now the Imperial line was being held with intense city fighting to hold back the Zoicans pushing deeper. Without the Imperial forces, Vervunhive would already be broken, but with their support and example, the primary fought on for every inch of their home. It seemed they had only a few days left before they would be overrun, and even now the Zoicans were pushing hard to reach and destroy the shield pylon, with the Imperials being pushed back slowly towards the only thing giving them the edge in the struggle. That our beloved hive should be conquered or should fall into controlling hands of unwise or unfit masters, I greatly fear and sadly anticipate. For this reason, I entrust this ultimate sanction to you. Use it wisely. Hieronymo Sonder to the Lord Chase. As Gaunt went to the Imperial Chapel at the new command centre, he was visited by one Merity Chase, the daughter of the recently deceased Lord Chase, who had sacrificed himself that day to reactivate the shield. She brought with her a relic, left in safekeeping with her family by the late great Hieronymo Sondar, to be used in only the most apocalyptic situations, though it is doubtful he saw this eventuality. No, his fear was that a more regular enemy, or an unfit ruler who would become a tyrant, would gain control of the democratic legislature of Vervunhive. Democracy, as all emperor-faring men know, is at minimum borderline heresy, but across the realm of man, all sorts of backward and nonsensical beliefs are allowed to fester, so long as the world in question does its duty and pays its tithe to him on earth. She gave him a system slayer, a potent tech weapon, designed to, if used, fundamentally destroy the electronic and codifier capabilities of the Hive. The idea being that if a tyrant arose and had complete technological mastery of the Hive, by deploying this the citizens would be able to revolt without the tyrant using the systems and power of the Hive's infrastructure to protect themselves. Everything would shut down and die. That was the idea, anyway. House Chase had long specialised in the creation of codifier systems and sentient cogitators, under the supervision and partnership with the Adeptus Mechanicus, so had built this near doomsday device at the greatest Sundar's request to act as a weapon of last resort to defend the city and its freedom. On another matter, and before we go on, and for the sake of probity, please know that this is worth noting for the record only, and due to how events would later unfold for Colonel-Commissar Gaunt, that it was on this night that he and the Lady Chase became intimate. The result of this encounter would emerge several years later. Day 36. The Spike. Has West Fort was now cut off and surrounded. Of the original 5,000 Vervun primary guardsmen and artillerymen manning the wall's guns, only a remnant of some 600 able men remained. The lower part of the fort was aflame and broken. Most of the guns were destroyed or out of ammunition, leaving this meagre remnant with only their las rifles. So it was a surprise that the fort and its gates still stood. With enemy forces entering the Hive from the south, they had encircled the fort, and its acting commander, Captain Kargin, estimated they could hold for another hour, if not reinforced. But reinforcements were coming to relieve them, fighting their way from the centre of the Hive's defensive walls. That was until the Spike came into range. The spotters on Has West Fort sighted it approaching from the west, a vast 500-metre high pyramid, moving upon multiple, enormous caterpillar units, demolishing all in its path, leaving a half-kilometre trail of destruction behind it as it slowly, but with unstoppable momentum, approached the Hive. Painted in the ochre of Ferozoica, and with vast chaotic glyphs on its sides, it had enormous starship-level plasma weaponry based within it. This weapon lit and fired, annihilating Has West Fort in one enormous blast, punching yet another hole in the adamantine walls of the Hive. This again shows the horror of the forces of chaos, for though they were in possession of this fearsome weapon, they did not use it until the end, and happily threw their deranged followers into certain death. Another thing that became clear to Gaunt and the Imperials was that this was the den of the heretic leader Heritor Asphodel, as this spike, as it became known, was the source of the Vox signals calling his name, which permeated the Zoican communications in a constant chant. The Imperials decided that they must strike at the spike. The Hive may fall anyway, but would certainly if this fell weapon was brought to bear on the main spire. So, this offered a chance for survival, to reclaim some small measure of justice for the people of Vervunhive, and, potentially, remove a grave threat to the Crusade by slaying this Heritor and perhaps, break the Chaos Horde, as had been seen in other campaigns at the loss of their champions. So it was decided a strike team of the elite forces remaining, drawn from the Volpune and Tanith, was gathered along with guides selected from the scratch companies. They approached the spike stealthily, a Tanith speciality, and climbed buildings the Spike was passing by to jump onto the fell machine. Gaunt himself using the power blade of Hieronymo Sundar to cut open a hatchway. The strike team first struck at the main gun decks, clearing them of enemy presence, but they were unable to knock out the gun. They then fought their way through the Spike, coming up against elite heavy Zoican troopers through the mass of the Spike's inner hallways, with enemy ambushes striking from every direction, bursting from the ceilings and flanks, using their knowledge of the structure to strike at the Imperials. But they fought through this, eventually reaching the command deck. During the firefight and melee that erupted, Gaunt fought his way, more by accident than design, to the central platform, which had upon it an energy-shielded dome, and was there met by the shimmering half-demonic Dark Watch bodyguard of the Heretor. With all his skill he fought these heretic elites, using the blade of Sundar to parry the chaos-tainted blades of these abominations. He beheaded one of these beasts in the furious swordplay that followed, but was wounded in the leg and fell. Trooper Bragg, cradling an autocannon single-handed, saved Gaunt from death when he made the platform and fired his heavy weapon point-blank on full auto into one of the beasts. The rest of the strike team, having cleared the command deck of enemy forces, quickly joined him, adding their fire to his. Two more of these fell creatures materialised on the platform, and one, wielding a cruel pike, managed to slay one of the team before its head was blown off from a Hellgun's underslung grenade launcher. The other two were eventually atomised as their corporeal forms could no longer withstand the whirlwind of las and hard rounds striking them. Gaunt made for the main cogitator and logic stacks of the Spike, attempting to unleash the System Slayer of House Chase. The strike team were holding the entrance to the command deck against a horde of Zoicans attempting to fight their way through and retake it. And outside in the city itself, the Imperial forces were being pushed back, despite the heavy casualties they were inflicting upon the enemy. The Spike also fired its main gun, the deck having been recrewed, and annihilated the shield pylon, removing Vervunhive's protection and allowing the Zoican artillery to unleash its fury on the hive once more. Gaunt inserted the System Slayer amulet, and with a perverse purr it went to work. The lights flickered 2, 3 and 4 times before cutting out completely, and the vast engine of death came to a sudden halt, all its power cut, leaving nothing but silence and darkness. With the vast machine dead, the shield dome in the centre of the command deck collapsed, revealing its occupant, the Heretor Asphodel himself. The Chaos Warlord stood, half demonic, with a cloak of shadow darker than the blackness of the lightless command deck. Gol Collier from the Scratch Company struck the creature with his axe rake, the tool of the labourer, and was thrown across the deck by a swipe of the beast's fist. Scout Sergeant McCall shot it twice, but was also sent through the air with a broken shoulder. Domar's lasgun blew up in his hands as he pulled the trigger. Others of the team were slain by the chaotic creature, until Commissar Colonel Ibram Gaunt, bearing the sword of Hieronymo Sundar, thrust it into the beast's chest, up to the hilt, the blue power field illuminating the scene, as the blade pierced the creature's back. For his efforts, and in a last act of malice, Heretor Asphodel fired his bolt pistol into Gaunt's heart. With this act, we have richly denied the darkness and made trophies of its creatures. A Dark Lord is dead. So this holy crusade, blessed by the Emperor, is advanced to glory. War Master Makarov at Vargest. Day 50. Remembrance. Learning via the Astropathicus that Vervunhive faced not an inconsequential rival hive, but a hunted Chaos commander, Makarov had made best speed for Vargest, arriving after 27 days of urgent transit through the war. The hazy sky was full of metal and looked like it should fall. The awesome power of the Imperium was there for every Vargasite to see. 10,000 ships, some the size of cities, some bloated like ornate oceanic turtles, some slender and serrated like airborne cathedrals. Makarov unleashed his might upon the planet below. 6 million guardsmen, 500,000 tanks, squads drawn from 3 chapters of the Adeptus Astartes, 2 Titan legions. Troop dropships, bulk machine lifters, and shuttles dropped in a swarm on the Haz Valley. For a while, the sky did fall. Mass destruction followed, lasting for 5 days. Though it was brutally one-sided. Hieronymo's amulet had done its work and cut the insidious chatter for all time. By the time the War Master's immense forces arrived, the Zoicans were already in total rout. Aimless and lost, they broke off the final assault. Many committed suicide or wandered blindly into the defenders' fields of fire to be massacred. Millions of others woke, as if from a dream, and stumbled without purpose or motive, back into the grasslands. Under Grisman's command, the battered Imperial forces that had held Vervunhive for over a month reformed to drive the pitiful, bewildered invaders out. Narminian and Northkarl tank brigades chased down and annihilated Zoican motorized units, threading back across the grasslands, towards their own hive. Colonel Bulwer and Major Ott, utilizing every troop-carrying machine they could raise, hunted out and slaughtered the fleeing troop elements in vast numbers. There was no question of mercy. Ferozoika's taint had to be expunged. By the time Makarov's armada made orbit, the Zoicans had been driven back 600 kilometers into the plains, leaving vehicles and equipment scattered and abandoned in their wake. In the crippled hive itself, scratch companies slowly weeded out the last feral pockets of Zoican resistance. The War Master followed up with unstinting vigour. He politely but determinedly requested the assistance of the Iron Snake Space Marine chapter to overtake and neutralise the fleeing enemy. His armoured brigades poured down the main highways and decimated everything that lived. Skeletal titans, shrieking like wraiths, stalked the grassland horizons, incinerating the retreating foe. On the 54th day, Crusade warships torched Ferozoika Hive from low orbit. The blinding flame flare filled the southern horizon, but by then, the fight was out of the Zoicans, and had been since the 37th day. Without the hypnotic chatter to unify their cause and drive them on, they had crumbled. Imperial Fist Space Marines ceremonially destroyed the spike, and incinerated the Heritor's corpse. From a history of the later Imperial Crusades. The victory was won, but Vervunhive was dead. The War Master himself signed the dissolution warrant, leaving Vervunhive a dead and wrecked ruin. A necropolis. The noble families and people, however, would go on to form 2 new hives, founded from the refugee population. Each would take generations, and perhaps centuries, to match the productive capacity and size of dead Vervunhive. But they would eventually, and Varghast would once again be an asset to the Imperium. One would be led by House Chase, which would devote itself to mining and servitor engineering. The other, under House Anko, would move in to exploit the now unoccupied Promethean fields, once owned by Hive Vanek, which was now an irradiated crater. In the years to come, there would be rivalry and blood as the descendants of these cities grew and the horrors of the past were forgotten. Ambition and greed would once more set into their hearts. But those things are for another history. Additionally, the War Master signed the Act of Consolation, whereby any citizen of Vervunhive who felt that they no longer wished to live upon Varghast would be accepted into the ranks of the Imperial Guard, where they could escape their former lives and in the Holy Crusade gain absolution and favour in the God Emperor's eyes by slaying the heretic on other worlds. 40,000 took this offer, and for regiments like the Tanith it was a boon, as so many ghosts had fallen that it would be fast approaching a troop strength where it would no longer be a sustainable fighting formation without the infusion of fresh recruits. Overnight, the dying Tanith First doubled in strength, taking into their ranks many of the Vervun Primary and members of the Scratch Companies who did not wish to stay on a world with ghosts and sought a new life amongst the stars. Gaunt should have died from the Heritor's bolt, but the Emperor does indeed protect, and the shell was deflected by a metal flower which Merity Chase had gifted to him to wear and remember her by. He dropped the shards that Dr. Dorden had dug from his flesh into the waters of the River Hass as he boarded the ferry which had originally brought him to the Hive, and where he had seen Hive Vanek die at the start of the campaign. A little later, a monument of remembrance was built, called the Chase Memorial, by the artist Thurrow of Northcole. It is a single guardsman, cast in steel made from the rendered down weapons of the fallen. It resembles a Tanith ghost, but only vaguely, being a memorial to all who fell. One fist is raised in eternal defiance. The War Master, though content and pleased with the securing of Varghast and the final destruction of one of the greatest enemy warlords arrayed against him, prepared for the next big push in the crusade. The Cabal systems were the next great struggle, and would see the Imperial forces pushed to the limit across multiple fronts for the next 2 years, as Makarov attempted to take free of the notorious Fortress Worlds. During this struggle, a miracle happened, without which the Crusade may have lost heart and faltered, and we will cover those events next time.